These were cut with hand saws. And so if they're using hand saws and not mechanized saws, we're looking at the earlier part of the 1800s. We don't know how early, but the hand saws become less common after about 1850. But I was not expecting these. In the excavations, because this site is narrow and it was a walk-over area for the whole community for most of the 20th century, I eliminated pork chop bones, chicken bones, and fish bones. Because for animal or human remains that are less than 300 years old, you cannot chemically date them. You need some other cultural indicator to date them. So the pork chop and chicken bones that the people passing by just threw down 50 years ago, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between that and one that was 100 or 200 years old. So those ones I eliminated. These are less common. And because it's a disturbed site, I cannot expect to think that as I go deeper I'm going to find stuff. No, the whole site was disturbed. But these were butchered. This was a surprise to me because I did not expect to find food remains in the cemetery site. But another feature of African influenced cemeteries is food offerings. You would, in West Africa, food offerings were put out for the spirit of the dead about a month after their burial, like a year after, on certain anniversaries, but they were put in certain places, because in West Africa they didn't have cemeteries as we know. That's a European concept. In the Americas, they had to do all of these things within a cemetery limit, because especially up to the early 1800s, regardless of what whites thought of these, black people were pretty much left on their own to deal with their burials. They were not harassed about that. In the Americas, you find food offerings in cemeteries. So either they're going in there and having a feast and or leaving food offerings for the spirit of the dead. But these are cut up in small bits and pieces. So these are finely chopped. These would be consistent with recipes for like a sauce, a soup, kinds of dishes that African people, whether they were enslaved or free, would have been using preferably, and hence they would need a rim plate or a bowl, because most of their food is going to have quite a lot of liquid with it. So they're putting food offerings. That blew me away. I so was not expecting that, because you don't find that in Bethlehem. On all of the other African influenced cemeteries on the other family islands, you see the trees, you see the dishes, you don't see the animal bones, the food remains. So these kinds of things are telling me that they were continuing with African influence treatments in this cemetery until about the mid-1800s. I know that because the style of dishes goes out. I only put in these samples, I have about 50 different types of ceramics represented in there. The styles that were made in the later 1800s are missing. The types of dishes that you see represented on this site are ones made throughout the 1700s and only in the first half of the 1800s, and then suddenly they are gone. You don't see them. So it means after about the mid-1800s, they stopped putting dishes on their graves. Why would they be doing that? Because this cemetery is on East Bay Street. That was always a highly visible site. My hypothesis on that, my theory on that, is that after emancipation, full emancipation comes in the Bahamas in 1838. After full emancipation, because this cemetery, this is an urban cemetery, we don't know who of these people were slave or who were free. there was always a mix because this is an urban area, it's the city. But after emancipation, there is pressure on people of African descent to tone down their Africanness. Our dialect stays around because you can use that in private settings. You can code switch, anthropologists call it. Your dress, you can change that. But very public things that tag you as African, if you want to move up socially, you need to move away from that. So my theory is that by the 1840s and onward, people of African descent are no longer wanting to leave the dishes on the grill, because even white Bahamians would understand what this means because they live around black people. They would understand what this means. It's very public, very visible. And so they're toning it down. They're moving away from it. That generation did not want that very public show of their Africanness to continue. These other cultural materials here represent something else. This pin, this is a gold filigree pin. This is a woman's pin. This would have been at the neck of a blouse or a dress. This was found below the cranium that I showed you that was covered over by the sidewalk. That's why I suspect that individual was a female. But this would have come in the second half of the 1800s, very Victorian, high neck. I found something similar by going through the Sears and the Ward catalog for the 1880s and 1890s. You find a lot of them similar. This here becomes even more interesting. I put a photograph of the original artifact in here. For the dissertation, I had someone do a drawing of this and this so that you could see the detail more clearly. But I wanted you to see the original up close and personal. I don't know if you could see the details, but what do you think you see on this? This is it's a metal button. It's a copper.
It looks like a button.
It looks like a button. The hands out.
It's a button, but it has a figure on it.
Eagle?
What do you? I know it's not very clear, but can you make out anything about the figure that's on it?
It's an eagle.
Hands outstretched. I can't see the bottom of it. But
Okay.
It's an eagle?
It's an eagle. This is an eagle. This is the head. This is the sun and some stars. These are the wings outstretched. This is the leaves, and this is the arrows. Which country does that eagle represent?
America.
America. So this came from a black Bahamian cemetery, but this was a British colony. Why is an eagle in a Bahamian cemetery?
no, we didn't have money, did we?
No. But when I did the research, this style of button dates to about 1900. This was for, not specifically for people in the military, but people who worked like with military contractors. But you know how things go. This button was mass produced and its use wasn't heavily controlled. So people who weren't even associated with the military could get access to it. I'm figuring the individual, and it would have been a man, who wore a jacket with this button on it, almost certainly had lived and worked in the United States, but either moved back to the Bahamas sometime before they died, or at least got back here in time to be buried here. But this represents Bahamian migration. From the 1870s onward, and it grows and grows. After 1900, it grows considerably. It slows a bit in the mid-20s when the U.S. Enforced their very restrictive immigration law, but Bahamian migration never did totally stop. The Bahamas had very heavy out-migration. That is why I think no one protested when the government destroyed the cemetery in the 1930s. I'm figuring either the people were like this guy, were in the cemetery already, or they had already moved away. The people who knew of it, who knew they had relatives there. People who live in the pond now are still aware that there was an old cemetery there, but there is a foggy understanding of exactly where it is. Generally, a lot of people think it's in the area that's reclaimed land. And actually, Miss Mara, Joan Mara, helped us solve that because I actually had people come in here to do an expensive ground penetrating radar survey of that reclaimed land area. And then Miss Mara told us when she was a child, the seawall that she played on was not the seawall that is there now, because the seawall that is there now, there is about an 8 to 10 foot gap from the top of the wall to the surface of the water. But she remembered as a child, there was a much shorter distance to the water. So then we got the very brilliant idea to go to Lands and Surveys and get aerial photographs, because since the RAF were here in the 1940s, we have aerial photographs that date back to the 1940s. And lo and behold, we got aerial photographs up to 1958, and it shows that area was not reclaimed until after 1958. But I suspect the reason why there was no protest, no outcry against that cemetery being destroyed earlier in the 20th century was because so many people had moved out. The people who live in the pond, I know because I had some relatives live there earlier in their lives. People who live there now generally migrated there from other Bahamian islands. So if they're coming in from other Bahamian islands, they know that's a graveyard, but they don't know those people. So even though they may be aware that there are some burials there, it's not their relatives. And that's why I think this cemetery could be so easily destroyed in the early 20th century. Literally, for lack of knowledge, people would perish. So I leave that now, and I switch to Center Burial Ground across the street. Now, at the Antiquities Corporation, technically, historic cemeteries are supposed to be administered by us, but we're not administering this. I took these photographs last week. These are of the trash in Center Burial Ground. This wall was put around Center Burial Ground in the early 2000s. That's when I had to do some emergency excavations in there because they damaged the earliest gravestones in there, putting in the big wall to beautify it for the tourists. This is where we go wrong, when we do things that we think will benefit other people, and we don't do things just because we need them done for ourselves.
Yes.
All of these graves in here, this is the grave of John Wells. John Wells established the first newspaper that was printed locally. This is his gravestone. Garbage. This is one in the corner from there. This is a view through the fence just next to John Wells' grave. These are the ones in the corner. All of these would be late 17th, very early 1800s. This is the view. Yeah, there is this tree was put in, this curbing was put in probably sometime in the 50s or early 60s. They destroyed some burials then. But remember that photograph, yeah, the grass is very high, not cut. They would clean up trash, but leave it right in there. This is some of the trash near the back gate. Trash, 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 all of this we had excavated. This is the current condition of Center Burial Ground. Our big challenge with Antiquities Corporation is that we have all these things. We have the archaeologists, but the archaeologists don't generally go and clean up modern trash. We deal with trash with like 100 years old or older. We don't have the manpower to deal with this. Ministry of Works deal with it. Their people, Ministry of Works would have done this because they are bagged. They just were never removed. And they have not been back in a while to rebag other stuff.